Okay, welcome everybody. I see we have a good group of people coming in and more every moment. I'd like to take a chance to welcome you now. My name is John Alquist. I am a professor in the School of Global Policy and Strategy here at UC San Diego. I'm also the director of the Pacific Leadership Fellows Program. And this is the inaugural Conversations for an Engaged San Diego. And I'll quickly just introduce the center and kind of thank our supporters. And then I will be turning it over to my colleague, Stewart Geiger, who's going to take us into tonight's program. So let me just say that this event tonight is happening under the auspices of the Center for Global Transformation, which is housed here at UCSD. It was founded in 2006 to foster sustained economic growth in countries in the Pacific region by bringing together worlds of academic inquiry and policy analysis. The PLF program, which is part of CGT that I direct, normally under kind of pre-COVID times would bring people to San Diego in person to spend time meeting with students, faculty, the public, and members of the community. That's probably not the wisest thing in the current environment. So we are developing these new conversations like we're having tonight. So hopefully you find them interesting and rewarding. So just so you know what we do, CGT supports a wide range of activities. We have things including the Big Pixel Initiative, which supports research using geospatial and remote sensing data. We have the Japan Forum, the Center on Commerce and Diplomacy, that showcases UCSD as a hub for political economy research. And we also fund a variety of different innovative research projects at the center, including work done by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, among others. And I'd like to acknowledge that none of this would be possible without the continuing generosity of the center's founding supporters, Joan and Erwin Jacobs. So thanks to them, and thanks to all of you for making time this evening to participate. So now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Stewart Geiger. Let me quickly introduce him. Stewart is an assistant professor here at UCSD in the Department of Communications, as well as HDSI, or Data Science Institute. He is a PhD from Berkeley School of Information, and he's worked at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science as a staff ethnographer, among a variety of other sets of projects. And his research uses qualitative, quantitative, and computational methods to investigate socio-technical systems, and so technology and knowledge production. So I think he is extremely well qualified to manage our discussion this evening. So I want to welcome him. And before I hand it over to him, I'd like to just highlight the next event we're going to have so you can put it in your calendars. So on December 3rd, we will be hosting Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia, as well as our own David Victor, to have an extended conversation about making deep cuts in warming emissions from the United States. So super timely and relevant, particularly given the outcome of the election. So I welcome you to come back for that. But for now, I'd like to hand it over to Stewart.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you so much for coming to this talk and discussion on the rhetoric and applications of AI in policing and criminal justice. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce two amazing experts in this topic who are going to guide us through a conversation about a number of issues that are very pressing in our society around the application of data science, surveillance, and artificial intelligence to policing and the criminal justice system. First, I want to introduce Rashida Richardson, who is a visiting scholar at Rutgers Law School and a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. She is a lawyer and a researcher who is interested in the social and legal implications of big data and data-driven technologies, particularly with a racial justice focus. She's worked on a wide range of civil rights issues at a number of great organizations. Most recently, she was the director of policy research at the AI Now Institute at New York University. Before that, she was legislative counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union of New York, where she led the organization's work on privacy, technology, surveillance, and education issues. Recently, she's the co-author of the report Dirty Data, Bad Predictions: How Civil Rights Violations Impact Police Data, Predictive Policing Systems, and Justice. We also have with us tonight Alvaro Bedoya, who is the founding director of Georgetown University's Center on Privacy and Technology and a visiting professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center. He is an expert on government surveillance and commercial data collection with a focus on their impact on immigrants and people of color. He's the co-author of The Perpetual Lineup, which is a year-long investigation into the largely unregulated use of facial recognition in U.S. police departments. as well as the co-author of Not Ready for Takeoff, about facial recognition in airport security. Before founding the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown, he served as chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law, where, among other things, he worked on overseeing the National Security Agency. He has testified before Congress and state legislatures, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. Thank you very much. I want to both invite you to give, they're both going to give about 5 to 10 minute presentations to sort of frame the issue and context, and then we're going to go into a question and answer period. So, Rashida?
Thank you, Stewart, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My opening remarks attempt to provide a brief yet not comprehensive overview of the historical and political contexts that have shaped policing and criminal justice in order for us to understand the application of AI within these institutions as a modern form of political and social reform, not simply innovation. I'll start by summarizing 2 books I highly recommend for audience members, but this also allows me to cover hundreds of years of history in minutes, so I'll take that. So the first book I'm going to summarize is Simone Brown's Dark Matter. In this book, Brown details the history of racial formation and methods of policing Black life, movement, and existence under slavery to show us how these practices and this history inform the development and use of contemporary surveillance technologies and practices. For instance, Brown argues that the 18th century lantern laws that mandated Black, mixed race, and indigenous people carry candle lanterns while walking the streets after dark and not in the company of a white person as an example of a supervisory technology that subjects marginalized bodies to hypervisibility and suspicion. This book demonstrates how modern day policing and policing technologies are founded in slavery, and by understanding this historical foundation, we can better evaluate the underlying logics that inform who is targeted by these technologies, who is disproportionately advantaged by law enforcement's use of these technologies, who stands to benefit from the use of these technologies, and whose interests should be centered in reform conversations. The second book is Alex Vitale's End of Policing, which details the failures of reforms aimed at producing better policing through superficial and procedural fixes, rather than the acknowledgement and mitigation of structural problems within policing. In particular, Vitale's book covers the last 50 years of political decisions that have increased the funding, responsibility, and overall impact of policing in society. He argues that both political parties embrace neoliberal austerity measures where only certain sectors of government and the economy were subsidized with the hopes that it would produce a trickle-down effect. These political decisions were also made at the same time that tough on crime rhetoric was employed by both political parties on the federal, state, and local levels, which helped to legitimize the inequitable distribution of government resources and the criminalization of activities and in some ways the existence of neglected communities. Vitale is insistent that his book is not about police accountability, but rather political accountability, because it demonstrates that social problems are created by political decisions, and that it's also a political decision to turn all social problems over to the police. This history and political context has fueled mass incarceration and brings us to our current moment where the US consistently has the highest prison and jail population in the world, with the majority of justice-involved people being individuals from the Black, brown, and poor communities. It is within this context that big data policing and the proliferation of AI technologies within the criminal justice system emerge. With this history and context in mind, AI and policing and criminal justice can only be understood as a new form of the same neoliberal reforms Vitale describes, which are aimed at producing better policing, not necessarily making better and safer communities. Predictive policing is considered a cost-saving tool that can improve policing outcomes by anticipating future criminal activity based on historical crime patterns. Actuarial risk assessments are marketed as making the criminal justice system more impartial because it can eliminate the need for regressive practices and policies like cash bail and reduce biased decision-making by judges. Automated license plate readers capture license plate numbers with date, time, and location information to help police find vehicles, identify travel patterns, and discover associations between vehicles and locations. Yet few of these marketing claims or justifications for purchases mention the impact or value to local communities, let alone how much these technologies cost or whether they work. They simply focused on making policing or the criminal justice system better, with no metrics or means for defining what is better and whom better benefits. AI as a policing and criminal justice reform is particularly harmful because it provides a veneer of objectivity and leans into the mythology of math while ignoring critical questions and concerns around safety, equity, and democracy. These technological solutions can also serve as a harmful impediment to necessary structural reform because as currently implemented, they normalize and obscure institutional problems like misconduct, discrimination, and abuse of power, in addition to normalizing and obscuring inequitable structural conditions structural conditions produced by government divestment and neglect of the same communities disproportionately represented within the criminal justice system. My hope with these opening remarks is to help the audience understand that AI is not merely a technical tool, but a social and political one. And in order for us to understand its risk and potential opportunities, we must evaluate all of these facets within the historical context of policing and the criminal justice system. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Alvaro, would you have some slides to share?
Sure, and that was a great opening and leads in well to a few of the remarks I was going to make. So I do have some slides. Let me see if I can easily share them here. There we go, and I'm going to share just mostly images to there we go, to illustrate a few of the themes I want to touch upon. So I was really excited when John reached out to invite me to this because this wasn't just a conversation about the policy and efficacy of machine learning in criminal justice and policing settings, but also a conversation about the rhetoric of machine learning in these settings. And I think we talk way too little about the way we talk about machine learning. And I think it's really fundamentally broken. And so at Rashida, you inspired me to offer 3 super oversimplified and purposefully provocative statements about machine learning and about the way we talk about machine learning. And so the 3 statements are the following. The first is that machine learning is not magic. The second is that machine learning is not neutral. And the third is that machine learning is not the future. And again, if these sound oversimplified, that's because they are, but we were having a conversation here. So let's talk about the first one. The first one is this idea that machine learning is not magic. And what's that a response to? Well, there was a moment in like 2013, 2014, when machine learning research started to pop a little bit. It really started coming into public discourse a lot more. And there were these breathless statements about, machine learning is going to revolutionize hiring and criminal justice and climate change. And it was this combination of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which are different things that closely related to each other. One is kind of a subset of the other. But I still think, 5 years later, 6 years later, that there's still an awful lot of that flavor to the way we talk about machine learning. And the fact is that machine learning cannot do anything. And in fact, it excels really in situations where you have bounded data environments and easily and fully measurable phenomena that you're trying to measure, that you're trying to make determinations about. So what the hell am I talking about? So there's a great little workbook. It's issued by the Allied Media Project, 2 extraordinary researchers and an artist, Diana Nucera and Mimi Onuoha. It's called The People's Guide to AI. And it may sound a little reductive. It's actually not. It's terrific. And they have this thought experiment in The People's Guide to AI. And it's called this cocktail party thought experiment. And the idea is they ask you to design an algorithm to invite 5 of the most interesting and fun people to the world's best cocktail party. All right. And so what you'll do, and I've taught this in class a couple times, is you tell people to do this, but then there's this big caveat, right? Which is in this paragraph, second to last paragraph, it says, you can only work with information that is publicly available. For example, social media public posts, comments, likes, follows, hashtags, events, the number of platforms they're on, and so on. And so you do this first with students, and inevitably they're super excited and they come up with this list of things. And but then you kind of remind them of this caveat, and slowly, people's expressions start to change, right? Because they say, oh, well, I'm going to get the people with the most varied tastes in music, or I'm going to get the people who always have something interesting to say in a conversation. And then you say, well, okay, well, is that fully capturable by some public information? And they say, oh, well, actually, my friend isn't really on Spotify. Or, oh, actually, well, my most interesting friends tend to not post on Facebook every day, and tend to not share everything they want to do with the world. And so this little thought experiment quickly breaks down into this really depressing exercise in the fact that these tools can really only operate on easily quantifiable and easily measurable data. And so this seemingly amazing cocktail party ends up being pretty boring and pretty reductive. And so you might be listening to this and saying, well, of course, machine learning, people in law enforcement aren't going to try to use machine learning on these super vague and ambiguous missions like, inviting interesting and fun people to a cocktail party. And then I would direct your attention to something called the Extreme Vetting Initiative. So what the heck is the Extreme Vetting Initiative? Well, I suspect everyone probably remembers the Muslim ban from January 2017. President Trump comes into office, immediately says that there's going to be no more travel into the country from all these majority Muslim nations. And I think North Korea was thrown in there for variety. And so these excerpts are from, well, I'll tell you what the excerpts are from. Most people focused on the parts of the Muslim ban that had to do with travel. Okay, but there was another section of the Muslim ban, section 4 of the Muslim ban, that said, in addition to banning travel, we need ways of vetting people as they come in the country to figure out if they're going to become, quote, a positively contributing member of society, and, quote, if they're going to contribute to national interests, and whether they, quote, intend to commit criminal or terrorist acts after entering the United States. And when immigration attorneys saw this, they were befuddled because on the one hand, the vetting process to come in this country is actually extremely strict post 9/11. And so we vet people like crazy to figure out if they're actually criminals or they want to commit a terrorist act. But then there was this other language about the ability to positively contribute to society and ability to contribute to national interests. And they said, that language is made up out of whole cloth and has no home in American immigration law. And so, and what happened? That Muslim ban was retired. Kind of people forgot about this provision, and then quietly, what you're actually seeing on your screen is language from a summer 2017 ICE request for information for vendors to propose to them and inform them about how they can make these determinations based on, drop down to the second paragraph, publicly available information, such as media, blogs, public hearings, conferences, academic websites, social media websites such as Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, radio, television, press, geospatial sources, internet sites, and specialized publications. And so this idea that we're not, and later on, and I'm not going to show you the page 50 of this filing, it expressly says we want to use automated mechanisms, including machine learning, to make these determinations. And so thankfully, the nation's leading artificial intelligence and machine learning experts wrote this, one of my favorite letters in American policy, where they informed the then Secretary of Homeland Security that not only was this program severely morally flawed, but it was also impossible. And so this would basically be setting money on fire and calling it machine learning. And so machine learning is not magic. Machine learning cannot do anything. That's the first point I want to get at. The second point is that machine learning is not neutral. And actually, I don't mean that at this exact moment in the sense that machine learning is biased, although I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. What I mean is that machine learning has value. It stakes a position. And to make that clear, let me show you an excerpt from one of approximately 100,000 pages of documents that back in 2015, 2016, we FOIA'd. We used the Freedom of Information Act to obtain from the nation's about 100 police departments across the country. And we asked them to tell us anything you have on face recognition, pardon me. And they dutifully, at that point, they didn't really know what we were up to. They dutifully sent along these documents. And we got lots of manuals, we got lots of policy documents. And then there were a couple really interesting documents, including this frequently asked questions sheet from the Seattle Police Department. Because in Seattle, someone had thought to ask the police department, or someone in the police department had thought to mention this possibility that this face recognition system might be biased against minorities. And so the FAQ dutifully answered, no, it does not see race, sex, orientation, or age. The software is matching distance and patterns only, not skin color, age, or sex of an individual. And I've been told this, I'm sure Rashida and Stewart have been told this at some point, where people say, well, how could this be, biased? This is just ones and zeros. This is just information. This is just neutral. And I've thought, I've had this conversation a couple of times, and my best answer to that is, let's say someone calls me a slur, or let's say someone, yells fire in a crowded theater. That's kind of like saying, well, did they really do something wrong? Or did they just kind of, say something using letters of the alphabet? This is just variations of this 26-letter alphabet, and they kind of mixed them together and put them out in the world. Like, what's so wrong about that? And the answer is, well, obviously these things have meaning. Obviously these things have effect in the real world. And this is not some reductive ones and zeros problem. This actually affects the real world. And another way someone put it that I think was tremendously effective, an extraordinary advocate named Malkia Searle, is it's pretty crazy that a system that's devoted to recognizing faces is said to not recognize skin color, age, or sex. It categorically recognizes those things and is categorically affected by those things, which brings me to my last point, which is machine learning is not the future. Now, what the heck do I mean by that? Because obviously machine learning kind of is the future if you're looking at investments of technology. What I mean by that is, again, there's these, I excerpted a couple of quick breathless statements about machine learning and business culture, how it's going to revolutionize our ability to predict patterns of crime and address our criminal justice needs. And if any of you are piqued by, your interest is piqued by the session today, you should all go and watch a great movie that's being released today that features one of the most exciting researchers in the space, Joy Buolamwini, a PhD of MIT. And Joy is this really great moment in the movie where she says, people don't realize that machine learning is not about the future. Machine learning is about the past. And what she means by that, and as she explains, is machine learning is only made possible by having vast, large data sets that you can train a machine on to understand what is right, what is wrong, what is a false positive, what is a false negative, what is a true positive, etc. And where does this data come from? It certainly does not come from the future. It comes from the past. And so what machine learning systems are fundamentally little c conservative. They're making determinations about whatever based on a trove of information from the past. And so in face recognition systems, for example, and San Diego, by the way, has been a leader in deploying these systems through the SANDAG coalition, there's a lot of biases built into that past. One of the oldest and most famous biases is around so-called Shirley cards, and I realize I'm going terribly over time, so I'm going to make this very short. But how did photo printers standardize their systems in the past? They standardized them with the help of a young model named Shirley Page. And for the rest of her life, Shirley's photo was used to print sample photos and see, oh, wait a second, she's a little dark here, or she's a little too washed out here. And so we're going to calibrate our systems based on Mrs. Page. Turns out that when you do this, you produce really bad photos for anyone who does not have a skin tone resembling that of Mrs. Page. In other words, Black folks, anyone who has a darker complexion. But I'm actually focused on a different problem and a different bias in that old data, which Joy has shown terrifically in a paper she did with Dr. Timnit Gebru, which is called Gender Shades. And she basically showed that a face classification system that doesn't identify people, but rather sorts them into male, female, was terrifically bad when it came to identifying darker skinned females. And why was that? It was, she hypothesized and argued quite precisely, because the data sets that we train these machine learning systems on are skew heavily towards white folks and men. And so as a result, you have systems that disproportionately make mistakes for anyone who is not a white man. And we had a couple terrible examples in Michigan that came out very recently of a gentleman who was falsely arrested as a result of a face recognition mismatch. And this is a very big deal. This is something that this gentleman, Mr. Julian Borchak, was, I think, put in jail for several hours, interrogated at the police station. Turns out it was all a mistake because of a bad face recognition match at the Detroit Police Department. So with apologies for going very long, I'm sorry about that. I got excited about these things. I'll hand it back to you, Stewart, and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna ask some questions. Those of you in the audience, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window to ask a question, and I'll be moderating those questions. I also have a few of my own to ask, and I also invite both of our expert panelists to, if you have any questions for each other, feel free to do that. But I guess I want to first talk about maybe how we got here, and on the theme of the rhetoric of these systems, and how we got to a place where, you know, we believe we can predict people's futures, and what in our popular culture sustains that. So I'm curious if either of you could talk a bit about the role that, you know, popular culture or mass media depictions play, either, you know, in the news or in fiction, and how, if there's anything you feel like you want to push back on that you've seen about what these systems do whenever they're on the big screens.
Wow, Stewart, you really started with a large question. I'll try not to ramble on this one, Albert, so we can both split this up. So I'll first start with some of the depictions that cause this sort of flawed view of how prediction and AI works. And I have a huge gripe with sci-fi depictions in particular. And that's because I think a lot of sci-fi content, specifically like visual content, like movies, films, or movies and TV shows, tend to project a certain image, not only about this being our version of the future where we're using biometric technologies and other AI applications, but it also shows this very distorted version of the future where I don't exist in most of these films. They tend to be heavily male, heavily white. And I think that's why it also skews people's views on the fact that these technologies work better than they actually do in reality, because they're working for the types of people they were designed to work for. And the rest of us that these technologies don't work for don't really exist in that future. And what does that actually say about the technologies within the future? And then to go on a completely different point, the other problem I think is with mass media dramatization of crime as well, whether we're talking about like CSI, Law and Order type shows, where I've like sometimes heard them in the background where they're like, we're doing facial recognition analysis in situations that are completely out of touch with how it would work in reality, which I think, and it also normalizes that these technologies are part of the criminal justice system, part of policing, and it sort of ingrains in our memory that like, oh, these are just things I need to adjust to because this is part of the future and this is part of how society operates. The other problem too is how media dramatizes crime, and that often it's a lot of inflammatory rhetoric that is also used by politicians about actual crime rates, which distorts the public views on what is actually happening in their community. So you can have either politicians or even media suggesting that we have major problems with violent crime. And if you were to look up your local statistics, that's not the case. You may have a property crime issue, but you don't have a murder issue. Yet all you're seeing in local media is murder and violent crimes. And when you're constantly being fed this type of information about criminality, who's a criminal, and what types of crimes are occurring, it not only skews what you think is actually happening in society, but it then enables you to be more supportive of priorities maintained by police departments, in that if police want to start targeting gangs as an issue because there was one big story of a gang bust, then the public is more likely to be supportive of those initiatives, even though they're likely just targeting young Black and brown people. And there isn't a problem. It's just, the problem may be the lack of community resources, the lack of government investment in the communities, the lack of jobs. As I was mentioning in my opening remarks, we were often talking about social problems that are created by political decisions, but instead how they're communicated to the public is that these are people that made bad decisions, and these are bad people that need to be targeted in some way. So I'll stop there because that was a great question and I don't want to take up too much time. But I do think media in general is doing a disservice to us as a society in misinforming us both about technology and also about social problems.
Since I went a little long last time, I'm going to keep this very short and just give you one example that ties perfectly into what you were saying, Rashida. The media both romanticizes the use of this technology and makes crime seem like every crime is a violent crime that ends up in someone being maimed or killed, when the reality is that most crime is petty crime, what lawyers would call malum prohibitum, or something close to it. So let me give you one concrete example. This is my favorite example. We had it in a report called Garbage In, Garbage Out. So I will briefly share my screen again. You're going to see Woody Harrelson's face. And so we sued the New York Police Department, and Rashida has, I think, done lots of work to expose folks at NYPD and wrongdoing, I suspect, back in your days at NYCLU. But we sued them to obtain the records about their face recognition system. And we found this slide that kind of rocked our world. Okay, on your left, you're going to see someone who was wanted for murder, no. For assault, no. For kidnapping, no. For drug trafficking, no. For petty larceny, for petty larceny. And what did this person do? This person stole some beer from a CVS. Okay, and what the NYPD did is they ran this individual's photo through their system. And now, of course, the pop culture, already we forked off from pop culture, right? Because pop culture, they're using it to identify a terrorist, a murderer, a child trafficker, or a kidnapper, actually being used to catch a beer thief. Okay. And over here, it's accurate and it produces this exact match. Over here, what happened is they ran this man's face through the system. No hits. And then, and this is 100% true, someone in the NYPD looked at this photo and said, hey, you know who that looks like? That looks like Woody Harrelson. And so what they did is they literally went to Google Images, downloaded a photo of Woody Harrelson, and then used that photo to search their face recognition system, and then went out and arrested someone because they were a match, not to the photo of the beer thief who looks like Woody Harrelson, but to a photo of the actor Woody Harrelson. Okay, this is a real story from reality, and I think a stark contrast to how this technology is described and depicted in pop culture.
All right, thank you for those great answers. So one thing I want to ask is, we think about these issues around policing in the criminal justice system as being kind of internal to government. They're about government agencies, but it also seems like this is a very big business. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the kind of commercial side of the money that gets made in selling these systems that may or may not work as advertised.
Rashida, do you want to go first, or should I go first?
You can go. I'll follow up.
Okay. It is big business, and it is interesting to see the different waves of competing interests. And so my expertise is obviously in face recognition. But what you saw first was the traditional law enforcement contractors, law enforcement vendors. And there's basically 3 to 4 big vendors in the face recognition space historically. There's a Japanese company called NEC. There's a French company called Morpho, which has been kind of sold and traded lots of different times. And so it's got lots of different names, Safran and et cetera. I actually forget what their current name is. And there is a German company called Cognitech. Increasingly, I think 3M may have bought them. But there's basically 3 or 4 of these. But recently, what started happening is that the big guns, American big guns, are starting to move in, and so Amazon is making a big play in this space. Microsoft is making a big play in this space. Microsoft, I think, has refrained from selling to law enforcement vendors recently their face recognition system. Amazon has put a 1-year pause in response to some bad press to selling these tools. But Amazon, very interestingly, is doing what Amazon did to bookstores, where anyone who's an investor knows that Amazon basically either ran even or ran at a loss for a very, very, very long time. And what it was doing was basically bankrupting all of its competitors. And then only recently, I think it started to turn a profit. And here it's doing something very similar, where it's orders of magnitude cheaper than those old guard face recognition systems sold by companies like NEC, et cetera. And so you've got a whole lot of players in the space that are competing for this very much growing market.
And I'll just add 2 additional points. The other sort of problem driving this is that many of these systems come into place because of federal grants. So there's also a lot of government money that is going into this from all parts. So if you're looking to make money quickly, law enforcement technology is a sector to go into. And there's also a revolving door between law enforcement and these corporations. There's a website, Little Sis, that's like crowdsourcing of information. And even here in New York City, we know that the former commissioner of the NYPD, Bill Bratton, is on the board of several law enforcement tech companies. And the reason I highlight Little Sis is because you can just see visual network maps of seeing how many law enforcement leaders or just lay folk working in law enforcement or law enforcement adjacent institutions like police foundations are all connected to these companies. So there's tied interest in why there's a proliferation in this space. And there's also a lot of money on the table to be taken. So I think rather than us seeing technology development for, let's say, public health as we work through a pandemic in other sectors of government, we don't see the same level of government investment in technological innovation as we do in law enforcement, as in other spaces. And I'll just give a caveat in me making that statement. I'm not suggesting that ML and other AI applications should start driving into these other government sectors. They're already there and causing many problems. But there's just a lot more money on the table in law enforcement for this to happen.
All right, thank you. I'm curious to ask about something that's a little bit more local, and I know that you're both on the East Coast, but we in the state of California just had voting on a particular proposition, Prop 25, which would have replaced money bail with some sort of risk assessment to decide if you would have to stay in jail before your trial if you were arrested. And you don't have to talk specifically about Prop 25 if you don't want to, but one of the things that it struck me about that debate is how people were very much arguing against a lot of the problems that were in the old system that were sort of very known, with a lot of the issues around money bail and how it can be used to further a lot of inequities and used in discriminatory ways. And so I might ask about how you weigh a new technology that might raise a whole bunch of new concerns when it may be trying to replace an older system that has a bunch of maybe very different concerns.
I think part of the problem is these are presented as a false dichotomy in that you're given only two options, cash bail and risk assessments, nothing in the middle. And I think just to give another example of the same problem outside of the technology space, this is also happening with the decriminalization of marijuana, in that you have some states like New Jersey, which recently legalized marijuana, but it was a proposition that had no criminal justice reform, which is a common thing in a lot of these efforts. And I think part of the problem with why it's only presented as this binary of one broken system for a slightly flawed but better system is that it depends on who's at the table. And often it's not criminal justice reform advocates. It's not people from communities disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. It's usually just bureaucrats talking to other bureaucrats, and then maybe a lobbyist from one of the tech companies there, which leads to this sort of situation of the only other option to cash bail rather than just eliminating it altogether in bail reform in itself is a risk assessment. And then often, and this was actually a funny thing with California, I think that was the number one proposition I got so many texts from friends in California about how they should vote, is I think there's also a lack of public education about these tools. So then when people are only presented with the problems of the existing system and then only 2 bullet points on the alternative solution, it makes it what people aren't able to grapple with the nuances there of what the inherent trade-offs are, and that you really are looking at two of the same sort of problems, in that, as Alvaro presented in his opening remarks, actuarial risk assessments are making these predictions on who's a flight risk based on historical criminal justice data, which existed in a system of cash bail. So how can you sort of de-link that system from the problematic system you're trying to get rid of? I'll stop, sorry.
Sorry, I'm getting excited about answering the questions in the Q&A. The professor in me wants to answer all the questions. On these systems, for example, the proposition in California, what I worry about is closely related to what Rashida just said. You know, I think people falsely think these systems are neutral and erase all these problems that they're previously visible, but the reality is that they just encode them. But what I think is problematic is that people think the opposite, right? People think, oh, it's a machine giving me this answer. Clearly, this is neutral, when really what's happening is that it's arguably just as biased as the old systems. It just looks neutral, and I think that's a real problem. And there's a good provocative and return question in the Q&A where anonymous attendee asks, why does the misuse of ML imply that we should cancel ML? And I think it's worth answering, because I think it dovetails with what you're getting at, Stewart. I don't think we should cancel ML, machine learning. I think that we should stop uses of machine learning where the users, in this case, the police with face recognition, have demonstrably failed after years of research and years of being on notice, have demonstrably failed to rein in the pervasive racial bias, gender bias, age bias that is currently endemic to these systems. They've continued to use them in ways that are opaque to the public and unaccountable to the public, and they've continued to misuse and abuse these systems. And so I think, I don't think we should cancel machine learning in general for any reason. I think it's a fascinating technology that could be used for great good, particularly in medical settings, perhaps. But I think that when it comes to punishing people, when it comes to making very decisions in the criminal justice system, I think we need to be very skeptical, because there are a lot of faults and problems in it that don't come in the packaging and the label and in the brochure that accompanies the technology, as it were.
Yeah, so I might jump into the Q&A. I was going to transition because I think that there's another question that I think is related to this and expands on this. And if you want to, both of you want to just say a little bit more. So someone asked, my question is, so what now? Is this a question of training the bias out of the technology? Is it eliminating the use of such technology? Should human oversight be reintroduced? And in the case that we're not just reinforcing bias, No technology is going to be perfect, and I agree that recognizing the bias is important. So now what? So are there anything particularly that you feel like you want to put on the agenda for?
So I'll start in that I think we first need to start with whether we're asking the right question. And that's partially why I had some of the points I made in my opening remarks of if you are trying to address issues of crime, like Alvaro said, most crimes are petty crimes or property crimes, which are really just a consequence of poverty and the lack of resources in communities, and not necessarily one of individuals or communities having inherent criminality that needs to be predicted through historical pattern or through looking at patterns in historical data. So in some ways you could have a perfect technology, but if it's targeting the wrong problem, it's never really going to work, or it can always produce bias and discriminatory outcomes. And I feel like that's part of the problem of AI and technology in the criminal justice system and policing, is that they forestall or completely ignore these larger problems that need to be addressed. So like we've had uprisings all this year, and a lot of them are dealing with racial justice, specifically scrutinizing the criminal justice system and policing, because there's at least an understanding that misconduct and abuse of power is a problem in policing. Yet none of the technologies we talked about today, and even if we gave a full survey of every technology in policing, none of them are actually focused on the problems that we know exist within the institutions or within the sectors more generally. They're usually targeted at civilians and targeted at these sensationalized problems that are dramatized by media or taken up by politicians. So, and I'm sorry for whoever's question. I know I am acknowledging I am not answering it directly, but it's because questions like these, I think, often ignore what I'm talking about, which is this is not what communities are asking for. These are not the problems that communities need solved. And all it does is shift money that should be going into communities and the public to private enterprise, which creates this cycle of government money being funneled outside of communities and into industries that have no interest in investing back in those communities, unless, I guess, it's Amazon. So I think we need to do a better job at scrutinizing what is the proper role of technology and doing more work to vision what types of communities and society that we want, and then figuring out the role of technology rather than continuing to regurgitate the same sort of rhetoric we're hearing from media and government and saying that these are the problems and then saying that technology is going to be the silver bullet solution to every.
Following right along those lines, I honestly, I used to be a reform it guy. I used to be a regulate it guy. And in fact, if you look at the very first page of our big face recognition report back in 2016, the perpetual lineup, like literally page 1 says, we're not going to stop this thing. We want to like put in rules of the road, et cetera, et cetera. And yet we kept on researching, and it just kept on getting worse and worse and worse. In 2016, we basically highlighted the fact that that police departments had, in most cases, secretly been going to the DMVs of the respective states and saying, "Hey, can we scan everyone's faces and use this for criminal investigations?" And the states were by and large saying, "Yeah, of course." So in 2016, we revealed that a majority of American adults are already in one of these police face recognition systems, and so these systems are being developed in a manner that is outside of public oversight, outside of public transparency. The very legislators who pay for these systems were in many cases outraged because they had no idea these things were happening. They're being used in, not only for serious crimes, they're being misused. People's sketches are being put into these systems. Woody Harrelson's photo ends up being used in these systems. And so I think that we need to look at the use of this technology for criminal justice very skeptically. And I think in most instances, it should not be used in criminal justice, flat out, full stop. And I'm not aware of a compelling example where machine learning should be used in the criminal justice setting. I think that there's this caricature of skeptics of machine learning that, we're Luddites, et cetera. Well, for one thing, I would say that, for example, my example of machine learning where I think it's a good thing is radiology. Turns out that machines are awfully good at detecting potential cancers than are seasoned, experienced radiologists. Why? Because you can feed in reams of scans that were positive for cancer and reams of scans that were negative, and the machines learn. And again, this is a bounded field, a bounded environment, clear yeses and nos as to who had cancer, who didn't have cancer, the ability for trained professionals to review them after the fact, and so forth. And so this isn't some blanket opposition to machine learning. This is a skepticism. And I'll tell you that the folks who I often find are most horrified by the use of this technology in the criminal justice setting are the people who are most expert in machine learning. For years, I've co-taught a course with MIT, and the more seasoned the computer scientists, the more candid they'll be and say, like, yeah, no, this should not be used to go and arrest people. This should be used for very specific settings in very specific circumstances. So I think there is a road forward, but I think we need to fundamentally rethink where that road leads.
So on this, and I want to wrap this up, and I know there's some other questions on some different topics I want to get to in the Q&A, but I'm curious, in all of your work and experience looking through how a lot of the police departments sort of use these technologies, are you aware of any cases of police departments using these technologies to try to predict whether any of their own officers will commit acts of police brutality in the future?
So there was a study by the University of Chicago that looked at 3 small police departments with this goal of trying to use police data to identify officers more likely to have an adverse interaction with a civilian. And it was a useful pilot, but we're talking about one pilot. And if I'm to compare that to predictive policing, we don't even know how many police departments have used that technology. So I'm just adding in that layer of complexity to also show that these are market-driven decisions and that police departments are not necessarily interested in buying technologies to address misconduct or abuse of power or discrimination. It's sexier and more palatable to get money to say we're targeting violent crime or rapists in our community, because that is sensationalized and will scare people into thinking that a priority is being met. But I do think that's where there needs to be more development. When I've had to talk to people in more machine learning and computer science spaces, I'm like, I want to have more examples to point to of useful applications of data analytics or machine learning that is addressing a social problem that we know exists. The problem is I don't have many examples to point to. And some of that can do with the lack of data, but also it's dealing with sort of false or an imbalance in motivations and interest, in that if it's not a marketable tool, no one wants to make it. And even if we're looking at academic development, I still don't see enough work happening where like people are working with community members to identify what problems could be useful for targeting machine learning applications towards. So that's a long answer to your question of that's one case. And then there's also some early warning technologies, but I also want to highlight that there is some mixed feelings within the criminal justice field about whether that's the best application of data, because you can still have issues with the data sets from the criminal justice system.
I'll only add there was a tongue-in-cheek study of predicting white-collar crime in Manhattan, and there was this in New York City, and there was a heat map that heated up over Wall Street. Yeah, there's haven't been too many examples of this. I think there was an activist in Portland who used the technology. So there was a problem in the recent protests where there would be incidences of police brutality and violence, and the officers were covering their badges, and so the activist was trying to make a point. And so what the activists did, I forget exactly the means, but I believe that photos are publicly available from graduates of police academies, and so they fed those photos into a system that could readily identify a police officer on the street. I don't I don't think these systems are good ideas for the same reason. I don't think the criminal justice systems are good ideas. But I do think that in the future, we will see more instances of this, and perhaps it'll force a reckoning for where the technology belongs in our society.
Can I just add one point to the white collar crime risk zones thing? I think this is an important, that was a satire, but I do think it's really important because white collar crime actually happens at a higher frequency than all other crime categories combined. When I was writing Dirty Data, I actually crunched the numbers, and like if you looked at granular data of certain jurisdictions or even national data, more people are impacted by white collar crime, yet that is not the crime that any of these systems are targeting. It's targeting violent, or actually it's targeting more property crimes than anything, but violent and property crimes. So again, if we're talking about actual problems in our communities, that's not where these technologies are being focused towards mitigating. They're often focused towards what's being sensationalized and what is more palatable to the public or politicians.
Okay, I'm going to read another question from the audience. So we've seen cities passing surveillance, transparency, and oversight ordinances, including Dr. Richardson's work in New York City. But these seem to rely on an active social movement and a civil society presence that can keep up with and interpret these new technologies. Are there models that are promising for supporting people who live in places without these sort of tech or nonprofit resources?
Yes, but there needs to be more. So I think part of the problem is there needs to be some type of community support for public education, because the only way that you get enough pushback to any of these efforts, or even enough support for laws that can help curtail or mitigate some of the problems we're discussing, is with support from communities. And I know in some of my work I did at AI Now and am trying to do this year is not only creating academic research, but actually public research that anyone can use to understand these problems and advocate for themselves. Because when we talk about policing, that's a local issue. So I don't think you can always just take model law and apply it everywhere, because it may not actually address the concerns or address the unique manifestations of the problem within a locality. But I do think there are ways to use practices and strategies from jurisdictions like New York, Chicago, and LA that have way more robust advocacy communities where people like me are paid to work on that, and try to figure out what makes sense for their communities. And then I also think it's on other, like, academics, we can do more. Like part of my problem is I say yes too much to trying to work with a lot of small groups all over the country, and I can't because I have to get paid and do other work. So I also think it's about how to think more critically about how we can be collaborative and think about coalitions, both locally in our own geographies, but how we can do better information sharing and network building so we can build on one another. Because one thing about a lot of these surveillance transparency ordinances is this is a way to like push things up to the top. If we know that on the federal level, there is not much debate about these issues or not much traction happening, then there's a need to sort of push this conversation up. And I think the more work that we see happening locally not only lets us see what works, but it also provides opportunities for new models that can be pushed up to the federal level, if there is the will to do something there.
That was great. I don't have anything to add there. And I apologize, Stewart. I've been just answering the questions. I don't know if I'm not supposed to do that. I apologize. I'll stop answering questions in the chat.
No worries. No, just move it to a different tab on my screen. But I think
one more tactical advice to that question. Also be active in local city council meetings, because even though like things are big here in New York City, we're also dealing with the most well-funded and largest police department. So you kind of do need a large coalition to take them down. But I do think if people, like, a lot of this stuff is coming up through procurement, which sometimes does have to be publicly reported. So I also think if you just start to pay attention, and luckily through Zoom, now a lot of city council hearings are on Zoom, listening in, and then you can start to pick up when these technologies are coming into your communities, but also whether or not legislators are even paying attention to these issues. And I've also seen in some local governments, I'm going to mess it up, but it was some city in Missouri where advocates actually held a counter city council meeting because they felt like their legislators weren't responding to them. So they held a hearing and invited them to come, and then gave testimonies for them to respond to. So I also think it's helpful to like think about creative ways of engaging local legislators.
I also want to ask, if there's another question around, whether this is something that on moratoriums on facial recognition kind of in general. And I think that there's different, it seems like there's different strategies that different groups and cities and the state and people working at the state and federal level have tried with things around, as you said, sort of procurement or requiring transparency or simply just a moratorium. And I'm curious how you see those different strategies sort of playing out and what you think about the future of those.
I can start with that one. Having been someone who used to be in the reform camp, slowly our whole team kind of went over to the moratorium camp just when the abuses just kept on getting worse and worse and persisting. That said, there's also a strong argument that some places don't want a moratorium, or it's just not politically feasible to get a moratorium. And I think that the worst thing in the world is, I think, for this technology to be unregulated in the police setting, in the criminal justice setting. I think that largely machine learning should not generally at this stage of its development be used in the criminal justice setting. But I do think that, let's say, so for example, Andrew Ferguson, a terrific scholar, I think now at American University here in DC, he has a couple of great papers on predictive policing, and the argument he makes is that there's certain kinds of crime that really aren't predictable. So violent crime is not really a good way to predict violent crime, turns out. But he says, well, property crime, there actually are a number of specific factors that make it slightly more predictable. And so obviously, certain kinds of property crime tend to occur at night. Oftentimes, if there's a burglary, that specific crime, there will be repeat burglaries in the near vicinity because presumably the burglar figures out how to access it or is familiar with the area. But you notice that that with property crime and the explanations I'm giving, these explanations kind of make sense. These explanations are based on prior data and they're explainable. That's what I'm trying to get at. Oftentimes what you see with machine learning is people say, well, it works. And you'll say, well, why does it work? And they'll say, well, I don't really know why it works. I don't know why this is telling me that. Explainability is a persistent problem in the field. And so I think what I'm trying to say is I could definitely, I definitely think there are jurisdictions that maybe won't want a moratorium or won't be able to pass it. And there's a number of things that these jurisdictions can do. I think the San Diego ordinance is focused on transparency and reporting and forcing city council to vote after a report that explores not just the civil liberties, but the civil rights, the disparate impact of these technologies. I think that's a great step in the right direction. And if we could have that across the country, I think that would be a huge step forward. And maybe there's a day when this technology is used for very specific uses in very specific settings where it's proven to be effective. And I won't preclude that, but I think for now, moratoriums, I'll stop. Moratoriums are attractive because it clearly stops some bad stuff that's happening.
I'll just add a little bit in that I think I've felt even more strongly about bans and moratoria for most criminal justice technologies, in part because their current use is supported by marketing claims of certain outcomes that we still haven't seen the proof of. And it's very difficult to prove any of these technologies work and the reason why I kept emphasizing you have to see technology as a type of reform is because police departments are implementing tons of reforms at the same time, maybe up to 20 in one police department, whether you're talking about implicit bias training, body cameras, and those are just very specific types of reforms. So how can you delineate that one specific technology led to a 10% decrease in crime? You can't. And when you're being fed those types of distorted facts and statistics as the public, then you believe that these technologies are doing something for good. And the reality is that we're seeing a lot more risk or risk of harm or actual harm happening from these technologies. And it's disproportionately impacting less empowered communities, communities with less resources to fight back. And it creates this sort of uneven dialogue where moratoria and bans seem just like ridiculous and overly restrictive measures, when really the question is, can you prove that these technologies are working and actually providing any benefit to your community? And most of the time, the answer is no. So why would we continue to allow for live experimentation of technologies on our communities when we don't allow for that in pharmaceuticals or the airline industry, other industries where there's very innovative things happening? We like some form of regulation, yet when it comes to issues of policing and criminal justice, we seem to be okay with some level of experimentation because it disproportionately affects Black, brown, and poor people who usually aren't at the table making these decisions and then have to deal with the disproportionate amount of the burden of when these technologies don't work.
So I might ask, if you were to talk to, let's say there's some maybe PhD students in computer science or data science in the audience, and somebody who does work in image recognition is maybe really inspired by the fact that ecologists use these facial recognition technologies to detect environmental, the counting endangered species, as a Microsoft ad that keeps playing in my streams keeps telling me. I'm curious, what would you say to someone who who has that more technical background, works in that field, but wants to finds these issues troubling? What kind of stuff could they do, or where might you direct them?
I would say, please, pretty please, try to go either into government or into civil society. There's a movement right now being built by Ford Foundation, MacArthur, Open Society Foundations, Mozilla, I believe, is pretty deeply involved, to create what are a field of public interest technology. And so there's precedent for this. Back in the 70s, Ford, among other foundations, put their heads together and their wallets together and said, hey, there's an awful lot of lawyers and way too few lawyers serving big corporations. There's way too few lawyers advocating for, the little guy, as it were. And so they invested heavily in the field of public interest law. And now what these foundations are trying to do is encourage these talented engineering students, computer science students, STEM students to don't just snatch up that job offer to go to the Googles and Facebooks or Vigilance or Clearviews of the world. These are big police vendors of face recognition technology, but rather, consider going to their state attorney general's office or the Federal Trade Commission or, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or any number of NGOs and civil society organizations that need folks like this. But I will say, Stewart, that the opposite side of this is, if you are the head of a nonprofit or NGO, if you are the executive director of a civil society organization, if you, run your state's Equal Employment Commission or its equivalent, you should realize that you probably should hire someone who knows their way around data. And so I actually think that the supply is greater than the demand right now. I think there's a lot of students who would do this, but more folks need to create these jobs. And I've never heard of someone being hired in one of these positions who I've heard of cultural disconnects, but when the folks have actually plugged in and started doing the work, I think it pays off hand over fist. So that would be my advice there, both for that student and for the folks who can hire them.
And I guess I'll give more abstract advice. The first, I think it's important to start getting engaged in local politics and with local community groups, because what I find really troubling is that there's a lot of people in sort of STEM disciplines that end up working on technology for, let's say, our topic, policing and criminal justice, that have no understanding of the problems of the criminal justice system until they are told what the problem is and how to apply data to it. And I think if students could develop a more nuanced and grounded understanding of these social problems, it would help them figure out for themselves, like, what is the right move to make with your own skills. And I would say, like, that's the same advice I'd give to someone who wants to be a lawyer or any other sort of actor within these sectors, is that it's important for you to actually understand what those issues are and how they impact people on the ground. Because then it's easier to, like, create a technology and not think about its impact when you don't have to think about the people who may be harmed. And I think bringing some humanity to these issues help. And then the other is the point I made earlier of, I think, like, as a country, we need to do a lot of vision work and have a lot more imagination of what we think it means to have an equitable and safe society, and then work towards what we need to do to advance that. And I've been encouraging anyone in school right now to, like, really do that deep work, because it's much harder. Like, that's kind of my homework annually. And it's always like, oh, in December I'll get to it. And I never have that time. But it's so crucial when you're trying to do any form of impact-based work, because you have to have an idea of where you're going to get there. And often we just almost function as if we're on a, like, Waze app and follow whatever we're being told, when really it's like you can sort of dictate your own direction. And I think, like, doing those two things of thinking of what you actually want that future to be, and then also being informed about what reality is on the ground right now, can help people have a better compass in figuring out how to navigate the world.
Excellent. Then I want to ask a question for everyone who is not a computer science PhD in the audience, which is basically, do you need to have that level of technical expertise to do this work? And is there any recommendations you or advice you might give for people who maybe feel a little overwhelmed by the technical details as they're trying to get into the bottom of these systems?
My answer is always no. I have no technical background, but I was always someone that was very good at math and science, so I'm not afraid to read computer science articles or more math-leaning things. I may not get it all, and that's when I talk to my PhD friends to be like, did I read this accurately? But I think you just have to be open to consuming a lot of different forms of information. And even though we've emphasized the technical aspects of these technologies, it's equally important to understand the social aspects, understanding psychology, sociology, and the other social sciences, which are deeply connected to how technologies are developed, how social constructs are formed, and how they become embedded in technologies, or certain logics that are built into mathematical formulas. So I think it's important to take an interdisciplinary approach to trying to understand both the social problems and technological innovation, because then it can help give you a nuanced understanding of a lot of what we talked about today, and that I think we did a decent job at incorporating both. But I also just think it depends on what you want to do. I work in policy. I'm a lawyer, so I stay in my lane. I'm not trying to build models. I can understand how they work and all of those bits, but I think it's figuring out what you need to know to do the things that you want to do, and then being open and receptive to understanding and reading information from different disciplines, so you can have a strong and sort of holistic foundation.
And I would continue on this path and say, I think it's necessary for whatever field you're going into to at least be conversant in the technology involved, even if that's not your core competence. So like you, Rashida, I'm not at all technical, but I'm also not afraid to read the papers and to talk to engineers and technologists, and you usually don't need to know how something works backwards and forwards to have a sense of what the policy equities are, and at least be able to understand it well enough to ask good questions. And so what I tell law students is, there's this problem. So for example, at Georgetown, if you label an event, machine learning, in policing, we would draw like this event, we would draw a certain kind of student. And then if you make it about, racial justice and criminal justice, you would get a very different kind of student. And that's wrong. And so I spend a lot of time telling the students who don't consider themselves comfortable in the first kind of event that's really focused on the technology, that we don't have a choice. If you want to have an impact in criminal justice, if you want to have an impact in labor, if you want to have impact on name the field, it is now increasingly mediated by advanced technology, including machine learning, and in the future will categorically be more mediated by advanced technology and technologies like machine learning. And so I think it's necessary to learn more about these fields and invest in that education, whether it's taking a course, reading some books, attending events, etc.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I think that's the end of our time together for this event. This has been absolutely fantastic. I want to thank both of you for sharing your deep expertise on this topic. You're leaders in this field, and I think we have all learned so much from getting to hear from all of you. John, is there anything you want to take over? Or?
No, I just thought I was gonna. You beat me to it. I think we're right on time. I want to thank you, Stewart, for moderating, and thank you, Alvaro and Rashida, for taking the time to beam yourselves across the continent to talk with us today. It's been fabulous. And I'd like to, we can all join together in thanking you virtually. I know we can't hear the thunderous applause the way you might hope, but I'm sure it's there in the background. And thank you all. And as a reminder to the audience, our next event will be on December 3rd, and hopefully we will see you there.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Have a good night.